Welcome to Cha Time. Today we're going to have a talk about unpacking the relationship between climate change and cultural heritage. Essentially, we're going to look at the links between cultural heritage and climate change and international conventions and declarations, and also look at some of the gaps and knowledge that need to be addressed in this area. So I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker. His name is Zaki Jumahri. He's a former student of mine in law school last time. He's now an independent researcher and writer. He has a decade's experience across the arts, cultural heritage in both nonprofit and legal sectors, and in private and public sector organizations. He's also written in arts publications, including Art Market and Art Republik. And he is currently pursuing the Art, Business and Law Masters in Law at Queen Mary University of London. And his research interests include Jawi and Arabic manuscripts, Singapore history and cultural heritage, and art and cultural heritage law. So without further ado, let me let Zaki start his talk. Zaki, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Jack Lee and Sicha, for inviting me to talk on this topic. This is a brief overview of what I'm going to be covering today. I'm just going to caveat and say that this presentation, unlike a lot of other presentations and talks that have been given over Sicha, is quite text heavy, so I do apologize in advance. But because of the nature of the talk and why I wanted to talk about it, yeah, so you can see me now. Because of the nature of the talk, I am focusing a lot on the language that's being used in conventions and agreements. Yeah. Okay. So, I was asked to share briefly why the interest in this topic. And so when I was approached by Jack and Sicha about this topic, it really brought to mind what I experienced a few years ago. I was a delegate in a regional seminar on copyright exceptions for galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. And what struck me was that we had a delegate from a South Pacific nation who said that, while the discussion on such a topic was interesting, she said that it didn't really matter so much for people like her, because from a country, from nations like her, because her nation, they had to move all their tangible cultural heritage to New Zealand for safekeeping, because the islands were affected by the rising sea levels and they couldn't really safeguard and keep their artworks and the material culture on the islands themselves. So I think that really speaks to the urgency of the issue and how some places are much more affected than other places. So why I wanted to cover this topic was also, when I was thinking of, what could I say about climate change and cultural heritage, which is part of, Sicha's current programming, I thought it would be interesting to sort of step back. A lot of the other presentations currently, they focus a lot more on specific projects. And I wanted to look at a more macro perspective and see how we could consider the historical context of international conventions. And I want to caveat this is not specifically as a way of looking at legal obligations per se, but it's more of examining the relationships between, concepts of climate change and cultural heritage that has evolved over time in international agreements. And, international conventions for me it's a top-down signaling effect, meaning that sometimes, you look to these, instruments, you look to the language and you see that as a way for the global community to come together in agreement about how, certain issues and how certain issues affect the community. And also, this is not my primary research. I'm not a climate change expert, but I've tried to put together the relevant research, and it's built on research of that others have done as well. And I don't know everything, so I love to learn from the audience as well on your perspectives and what you think about this topic and issue. So, I mean, while I go into sort of the specific details of these conventions, I thought it would be useful for the audience to have these questions to keep in mind. First, where and how can we trace the relationship between climate change and cultural heritage in international agreements, declarations, and their related documents? What are the relevant keywords? What are relevant concepts? What are the existing gaps in the relationship? And how can we address these gaps? When looking at these, international conventions and language, we all have blind spots sometimes about the kind of things that we are looking out for. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So I thought it would be good to revisit, the key concepts, in this topic so that everyone is on the same page, and it's sort of a quick refresher. So again, what climate change is. We have this definition from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Basically, it's a change that persists for an extended period, typically decades or longer. And you have this other definition from the UNFCCC. It's this change. It occurs directly or indirectly because of human activity. And this is sort of a definition that I've sort of cobbled together from different sources. And I thought what was interesting was the idea of, more frequent and intense hydrometeorological events, heat waves, cold waves, fires, droughts, flooding, marine heat waves, tropical cyclones, and coastal erosion. I felt it quite keenly in London this week with the heat wave. And last year, London had floods. So during the summer, so who knows what's going to happen to London next. And of course, if you want to read more widely and deeply on the effects of climate change, you can look at the different reports that are on the UN website by the IPCC. So, we talked briefly about what climate change is, and I think as the audience, you're more familiar with what cultural heritage is. There's so many definitions of what cultural heritage is, outside of international conventions. So Prod and O'Keefe talks about, how it's about how human life is manifested, representing particular value and the history and validity of that view. But I think when we think of all of the details of it all, you have, both intangible cultural heritage and tangible cultural heritage. And within the category of tangible cultural heritage, you have movable and immovable. So the example that I gave you earlier of hearing from the South Pacific nation, they had to, their tangible cultural heritage, their movable, had to be transferred and transported to New Zealand for safekeeping. And immovable would, be like, so see, this is the definition in the UNESCO 1970 Convention on the illicit trafficking of property. And so this is the definition, of something that is important for archaeology, prehistory, history, literature, art, or science purposes. And for immovable cultural heritage, it's not just monuments, obviously, you have sites, as well as, and so, but what was important is the idea of outstanding universal value in terms of cultural heritage. And I also wanted to revisit, what intangible cultural heritage is. It's basically the practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, and the instruments, objects, artifacts, and cultural spaces transmitted from generation to generation, constantly recreated in response to environment, interaction with nature, and history. For completeness, I decided to include underwater cultural heritage, even though it doesn't really play that big a part in my view, but I thought, good to have it in. And this, refers to all trace, cultural, historical, or archaeological character which have been partially or totally underwater periodically or continuously. So I thought this was a useful table that I came across while Googling on the internet. It's taken from this research literature review, basically undertaken by these researchers, trying to pull together, from all the different individual research and studies on the impacts of climate change on cultural heritage. What are the links? What are the effects of climate change on cultural heritage? So I thought it was really interesting. You see all the different arrows and how they match, and how they link, between different points, and so I don't think this is exhaustive. I mean, perhaps, there are other things, there are other ways in which climate change can impact cultural heritage, but I think this is sort of a useful start. And so I think for me, besides the usual suspects, when you think about, climate change can impact, cultural heritage sites, archaeological sites, through damage or loss. I thought what struck me was also the impact on the, underwater cultural heritage, decrease in stability of underwater heritage from the change in sediment balance, for example, or corrosion of underwater metal resources through metal corrosion, and like ocean acidification. So I think it's really drawing the links and sort of making us aware of how climate change is impacting so many things in cultural heritage that we may not necessarily know the detail or the extent. And these are just some statistics that I found, through the research that other people have done. So I think there was a 2005 UNESCO survey stating that 72% of natural and cultural heritage sites, and which, from the several state parties to the convention, when they responded to the survey, and they say these were under threat by climate change. So that's quite a high percentage. 2014 study found that more than 130 World Heritage cultural sites were at long-term risk from sea levels rise. And I think more recently, about a third of World Heritage properties are at risk of suffering loss and damage from climate change. And almost a third of World Heritage cities are coastal and at risk of climate change. And then, for this last point, I thought it was quite interesting what UNESCO has done recently. They've done sort of the data visualization of the different stresses and factors that can, negatively impact or adversely impact intangible cultural heritage, which are in danger or in threat of dying out. And so the way that they see climate change is that it affects traditional ways of living and deteriorating conditions for the practice and transmission of intangible heritage. But there's some cool visualizations and images there. So, please do check it out. It's a very cool project. And we've talked about climate change and cultural heritage. And I thought at this point also I'd introduce the concept of I'll revisit the concept of sustainable development. And you may think, why are we talking about sustainable development? I mean, this topic, climate change and cultural heritage is sort of the focus of of this presentation. Why are we talking about sustainable development? So let me explain to you. So this is a definition of sustainable development that came out in the Brundtland Report in 1987. It means the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So this definition actually recognizes the tension and need for balance between humanity's growing needs and our reliance on the natural environment's future survival. It's sort of like, like we need to think both of the present and of the future at the same time. And connected to this is this idea that, when you want to consider environmental issues, they are really closely connected to other global issues. And so although the report doesn't mention climate change, it arguably helps develop international environmental law. When you think about sustainable development, the concept of sustainable development, it's sort of the precursor to the international community's acceptance of climate change. And sometimes if you don't see the terms climate change being used, maybe it's useful to consider what other terms like sustainable development have been used, or what kind of other language has been used as well. Yeah, and so this 1987 definition has become very widely accepted as a definition of sustainable development. So I thought that, we don't have a lot of time, so I've sort of tried to narrow down, conventions, agreements on environment and climate change that I thought might be useful to sort of briefly consider. And so, the first one is the 1994 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's a treaty to address, dangerous human interference with the climate system. This is the first ever climate change convention agreement internationally. So it's really a foundational treaty. And of course, you have the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, where it implements measures under the UNFCCC to reduce, onset of global warming, reducing greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. And lastly, you have the 2015 Paris Agreement, which covers climate change mitigation, adaptation, and finance. They're trying to make sure that the rise in the mean global temperature is well below 2 degrees Celsius and hopefully under 1.5 degrees Celsius, because otherwise it's going to make living in this world very, very unbearable. So I wanted to try and pick apart language, as I mentioned earlier, in conventions, agreements on climate change. And these are taken from the preambles of conventions, agreements. So, this is not a law lecture, but just to explain what preambles are, they really, explain reasons why parties enter into these treaties and conventions. And they usually have a political significance, and they want to explain what is the rationale, what is the policy behind this treaty or convention. And it expresses parties' goodwills, intentions to achieve certain aims. So for the UNFCCC, they don't, and so from this perspective, I wanted to see, from the conventions on climate change and agreement, do they reference, cultural heritage or culture or heritage, and how so, and in what ways? And from the UNFCCC, I think the closest I could find was this excerpt, and talking about responses to climate change should be coordinated with social and economic development in an integrated manner, with a view to avoiding adverse impacts on the latter. I think it's maybe the link is quite tenuous. It's not very clear. When you want to talk about culture and heritage, you're not really using this term specifically, but maybe you could see well, social development. I think cultural heritage is sort of important and critical to social development. But this is really it from the UNFCCC. So 1994, culture and heritage perhaps wasn't as clearly defined or explicitly made important. And then when you talk about Paris Agreement, which is like more than 20 years later, you do have more of an explicit acknowledgement of indigenous rights, indigenous people's rights. Taking action to address climate change. They need to respect, promote, and consider respective obligations on the rights of indigenous peoples. And so there is that sort of you can see the evolution, of the recognition that, we do need to take into account how we protect the rights of indigenous people, and connected to that is, rights of them to practice, their indigenous knowledge and traditions, which, could mitigate, climate change. And as you may have figured out by now, there's nothing from the Kyoto Protocol. And that's really because the Kyoto Protocol is a very technical environmental document, scientific document. And so they don't have like a preamble where, it's where they're talking about, affirming or acknowledging. So there's nothing in there really that can point to culture heritage or cultural heritage. So, okay, there's this gap already that you can see from climate change agreements. So what about declarations, and I think declarations you can find, I think the 1992 Rio Declaration is really, again, the emphasis on indigenous people and their communities and other local communities, having their knowledge and traditional practices. So here it's a recognition of intangible cultural heritage. You could argue, that these intangible cultural heritage has a vital role in environmental management, and perhaps even, and you can even go further to say, mitigating climate change. And again, in the 2002 World Summit on Sustainable Development, again, vital role of indigenous people in sustainable development. So from the perspective of even the environmental declarations, you don't really see anything on, similar to the climate change conventions, you don't really see anything on tangible cultural heritage, like movable or immovable, but you do see more of a recognition of the impact of climate change on intangible cultural heritage. And I just thought, to be a bit more comprehensive, or I included the Conference of the Parties, which is really sort of the highest governing body of the International Convention, which is the UNFCCC. And they talk about, we need to emphasize the important role of indigenous peoples and local communities' cultures and knowledge, and actively involve indigenous peoples and local communities in designing and implementing climate action. From what I understand, this is the the fact that they're mentioning this, is quite a big deal. And again, it's the reference to intangible cultural heritage and a growing recognition, I think, of not just the impact of climate change on intangible cultural heritage, but what intangible cultural heritage can contribute to mitigate climate change. So we've talked about, briefly about conventions and agreements from the environmental and climate change side and declarations. So what about cultural heritage? So briefly going through 3 conventions. The first is the World Heritage 1972. So I wanted to take you through sort of, how perhaps maybe these cultural heritage conventions, whether they reference, climate change or the environment or even other terms, and here the World Heritage Convention, they talk about, cultural heritage and natural heritage, perhaps being affected by changing social and economic conditions. And so, I think that it's quite, maybe not as obvious, but, social and economic conditions can also drive, climate change, the way that things have become more corporatized and industrialized does in a way contribute to climate change. And sorry, that was one point that I wanted to add as well. When you think about cultural heritage, and for me, my blind spot is, I'm more familiar with cultural heritage and not so familiar with natural heritage. And I often forget that, the full title of the World Heritage Convention is actually the Convention Concerning the Protection of the World Cultural and Natural Heritage. And so even within the convention title itself and within the text, you know, even if you don't talk up, even if you like don't see like obvious sort of climate change recognition and acknowledgement, there is this idea that, you know, cultural heritage and natural heritage are intertwined and are interconnected. So again, just mentioning, you know, Articles 1 and 2, you know, protection, conservation, presentation, you know, state parties must protect and conserve cultural and natural heritage. And I mean, I think what was interesting for me is that looking at this particular section of the World Heritage Convention, you know, where they talk about list of World Heritage in danger, which are threatened by serious and specific dangers, they do list out events, climate change events. They don't say that they're climate change, but these are events that really do come as a result of climate change, you know, changes in water level, floods, tidal waves, serious fires, landslides, calamities, and cataclysms. So there is that implicit recognition of climate change, even if they don't say it out loud. And I thought even what was also interesting was, you know, but perhaps, you know, maybe the understanding was not as developed as it is now. You know, they grouped it together with, you know, geological events like earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, which have very different sort of causes from like water levels, floods, and landslides and serious fires. And I guess also, I mean, bringing it back to sort of the historical context, you know, perhaps also it's understandable that the World Heritage Convention, because it dates back from 1972. It's understandable that it doesn't really have the word climate change, because the word climate change really only started being used in 1988 with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change being established. So that's like sort of 16 years in advance. So maybe, you know, that's a good reason why. But even putting that aside, you know, these descriptions are sort of telling. And you know, within the World Heritage Convention, you have these operational guidelines. You know, as the name suggests, you know, they operationalize how state parties should implement and comply with the World Heritage Convention. And I wanted to, you know, point out that from 1997, they did start using the term climate change. So although it's not even the main text of the convention, it is in the operational guidelines. They also use the term climatic or other environmental factors as one of the factors to be identified for World Heritage sites that are in potential danger. And also to note that the recognition of climatic or other environmental factors has been present in the operational guidelines since 1983. And you know, the operational guidelines have become more sophisticated over time. You know, they've really evolved, and there is now a more nuanced understanding of climate change within its operational guidelines. You know, looking at, for example, maybe like, you know, vulnerabilities of the property to climate change. Climate change is an element in management plans and training strategies. And also looking at, you know, the policy documents that state parties, you know, have to use in order to interpret and sort of guide how they implement their obligations under the World Heritage Convention. So these are, you know, really, really sort of helpful ways in which the people behind the people working to implement the convention are really recognizing, acknowledging the impact of climate change. And I thought I would stop here to just point out, you know, like, so the World Heritage Convention also has policy documents, which are really intended at, you know, providing World Heritage, you know, guidance, decision and policymakers with guidance on key issues. And you know, what I wanted to point out was that, you know, 2007, you look at the title, you know, on the policy document that impacts of climate change on World Heritage property, and you compare it to the 2021 policy document on climate action for World Heritage draft. 2007, the title, it's quite one-sided when you think about, oh, it's sort of just looking at how World Heritage property is impacted by climate change. But in 2021, you're recognizing that, oh, actually it works both ways. You know, climate change can impact World Heritage, but perhaps World Heritage could also, help impact climate action as well. And I thought it was interesting also how in the draft 2021 policy document, you know, they also have climate action goals for 2030, which 2030 is such an interesting timeline because it dovetails with the Sustainable Development Goals timeline of 2030 as well. And so I think it's a more sophisticated, nuanced understanding of what climate action needs to be done for World Heritage sites. So now we come to the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention, or the full title is the Convention on Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage. So again, what we're trying to do here is trying to tease out and understand, you know, do they talk about, you know, climate change or environment? And here they talk about sustainable development. So that, you know, when you think about, so the Cultural Heritage Convention dates back to 2003. And, you know, it has been said that it came about due to the increased recognition of cultural rights and cultural diversity in the national sphere. And I thought it was really interesting that they talked about sustainable development. You know, the intangible cultural heritage must be compatible with the requirements of sustainable development. So there is the understanding that the environment is really important when it comes to intangible cultural heritage. You know, yeah, it's really a precursor to climate change. So again, you know, preservation, protection, promotion, enhancement of intangible cultural heritage. And they also have operational directives. So like World Heritage Convention has operational guidelines. These are operational directives, again, to operationalize the convention. And again, what for me is interesting is a lot of words, but it's really about the focus on enhancing community resilience towards climate change. And so it's a really sort of interesting relationship where yes, they recognize that climate change can impact intangible cultural heritage, but intangible cultural heritage can also impact climate change in order to reduce its impact on intangible cultural heritage. So it's really interesting for me, just sort of seeing the relationships and how, you know, these relationships can develop in the future. And recently they also had a sort of a document that was adopted by the General Assembly, UN General Assembly in September 2020, which is a Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage in Emergencies. So it covers, you know, something more generally than just climate emergencies, you know. But I think what's really interesting is the idea that, you know, communities need to play a primary role in identifying their intangible cultural heritage, what measures are needed to safeguard it as a resource for enhancing their resilience. Again, this idea that intangible cultural heritage can contribute to resilience in climate emergencies. And for completeness, I thought I would touch briefly on the Underwater Cultural Heritage Convention. So these are, you know, remember the definition that I referenced earlier on underwater cultural heritage. And so it's necessary to protect underwater cultural heritage for state parties, and to note that preservation in situ of underwater cultural heritage is the first option. And each state party shall use best practical means to prevent or mitigate any adverse effects arising from activities incidentally affecting underwater cultural heritage. I think this convention is really interesting because it was really aimed at addressing questions related to like salvage of wrecks, sites and objects underwater, and also like addressing objects of archaeological importance. So you can see, these are sort of like, for me, these excerpts are like sort of the closest in trying to get in trying to see, the link to climate change. Because you need to, if there are activities that can impact climate change and therefore impact underwater cultural heritage, and state parties should do their best to prevent and mitigate such adverse effects. So I think the broadening is word enough. The wording, sorry, is broad enough. But I think that's really sort of the extent of where, maybe references to climate change are being used in the Underwater Cultural Heritage Convention. I'm not aware of any sort of operational directives or guidelines for this convention. So I don't think there has been any updated text. But of course, I might be wrong. So I'm happy to learn as well on this issue. So there's been so many words, so much text, and I thought maybe I could, I wouldn't say this is a summary, but it's sort of a snapshot of different events that have happened over time to give you a historical context of the relationship between climate change and cultural heritage. So in the top half, what you're seeing is the relation, is sort of more of a focus on cultural heritage and how they and how they've tried to address climate change. And on the bottom half, you see more of from the climate change environmental side, and how maybe they've tried to address themes of like cultural heritage or cultural heritage. And I think from that timeline, you can see that not much was going on between the 1970s and the 1990s. But after that, there really was a growing awareness, especially I think in the mid 2000s when I think about 4 petitions were filed with the World Heritage Convention in 2004 to sort of highlight, what was happening to World Heritage sites as a result of climate change. And that led to the World Heritage Convention strategy and then policy documents. And so it sort of set certain things in motion, and there are still things happening in motion. So I think that over time, the language of climate change has become more explicit. You're really seeing the term climate change, but I think even though it looks from this timeline that a lot of things have happened from the mid 2000s onwards, I think we shouldn't forget that even from the early stage in 1972, if you look back, it's interesting that the World Heritage Convention came into being in 1972, and in the same year, you had the UN Conference on the Human Environment at Stockholm. I think that's there's probably a good reason as to why they have this sort of connection from the beginning of 1972, recognizing the importance and the interconnectedness of not just tangible cultural heritage, but also natural heritage together, and the protection of the human environment at the same time. So it's really about looking for different languages, different words, and different references in those days, as opposed to looking for the term climate change. So, so what are some of the existing gaps I think, that I think might be worth looking at? So first, I think is the absence of explicit acknowledgement and recognition of the importance of tangible, immovable cultural heritage. So, and the broader category of intangible cultural heritage in the context of climate change declarations and agreements. I think that, I think in the rights and knowledge of Indigenous peoples are rightly being recognized, but I think, it would be good to sort of, talk about intangible cultural heritage, tangible, immovable cultural heritage, rather than just using the term, cultural heritage and stuff like that. I think it's good to put, to really be more specific, because, they all have different considerations, they're not all the same thing. And sometimes even when people talk about people outside the field, they talk about cultural heritage, they do have blind spots as to what they think cultural heritage is, they may have a preference as to one over the other. So I think it's good to make it more prominent and distinct, and maybe that's something they should think about, in future climate change agreements or declarations or instruments. And also tangible movable cultural heritage, as I mentioned, very early on in presentation as to why I was interested in this topic, they are, some places are, disproportionately more affected by climate change, especially low-lying, small developing island states, that, if sea levels continue rising at the rate they are, they won't really have much of a choice as to where they can safekeep their cultural heritage. They have to move it somewhere, and so this needs to be addressed as well, I think. And also I think that there hasn't been much chatter about underwater cultural heritage. That's sort of like, I don't know whether maybe because people don't think about underwater cultural heritage, or maybe they subsume they include underwater cultural heritage as under the categories of movable cultural heritage or immovable cultural heritage. I'm not sure, but I do think there needs to be some sort of explicit acknowledgement and recognition of the importance of underwater cultural heritage within this context. So some concluding thoughts. I think the relationship between climate change and cultural heritage has existed for longer than some may have initially assumed, in more nuanced and less explicit ways. Nonetheless, there are some existing gaps that may need to be remedied to more accurately reflect the close intertwining relationships between climate change and cultural heritage. And finally, more work needs to be done to more accurately reflect the actual impact of climate change on objects that may not immediately capture the attention of policymakers and the public. So yeah, I mean, ultimately, this is sort of a quick snapshot and really a selective snapshot. I think there are many more agreements and declarations and conventions that you can probably think of, and that you can mention and think of ways in which they sort of help to link climate change and cultural heritage. And I'm happy to hear from you as well on this topic. Yeah, these are just some concluding thoughts. So thank you very much for listening to this very, very text-heavy presentation. Apologize if, because a lot of the other presentations are not as text-heavy, but yeah, because of the emphasis on language and the words used, it was necessary as part of this presentation, but I hope that you learned something new today as well on this topic. So thank you very much. And I guess you could have a Q&A starting if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for the organizers to allow me to start my video. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Zaki, for taking us through these conventions, which I think show how the international community is at least trying to recognize the problem. And I'm sure we'll get into what happens next. But I just want to let everyone know that if you have questions, you could either use the Q&A box to type your question, or I guess you can also, I'm not sure, I can't see anyone, but I don't know whether the organizers can see people, the participants, and if you want to raise your hand and ask it that way, I guess it's okay as well. Is that right, organizers? Otherwise, just use the, okay, yeah, I think they just would prefer that you use the Q&A box. So if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box. Maybe I can start off, Zaki, by asking you this, right? So it looks like, because there's this recognition now of the importance of the effect of the climate emergency on cultural heritage, and it's beginning to appear in official documents as well as treaties and declarations and so on. How do you think this would be helpful in therefore encouraging countries as well as people to do something, to implement it? How do we translate it from just being a declaration into actual action on the ground?
I think first of all, it's a signaling effect. I think, I mean, from my participation in sort of regional seminars, you know, a lot of times countries or delegates, they are looking for signals from the international community. And they can't really take steps without these signals, or there's not enough of a push. They need something broader in order for them to tag on to. So I think this is a start, at least, in order to sort of push them in the right direction. I think there needs to be more, obviously, the situation is going to be different from each country and for each region, and how they deal with climate change and its impact on their cultural heritage. But I also think that it's a very complex endeavor. It's not easy, trying to educate people and trying to, well, not educate, that sounds a bit condescending. I think it's about sort of sharing and maybe getting everyone on the same page, and making sort of topics like these are more accessible, and easier for people to follow and be able to create something tangible or some progress in the future. I mean, yeah, I think it also depends on the willingness of state parties as well. Obviously, there's some state parties who are more willing than others because they know the urgency. They can see the impact of climate change at their doorsteps or at their shores. They can really see the difference. And so for them, you know, it's become a climate emergency, basically. You know, they have no they have no other choice. You know, they have to move their cultural heritage or their artworks or their material culture, you know, to another country. Which is kind of like, it's a kind of a horrible, it's a kind of a horrible thing to consider, because you can't even protect your own cultural heritage at this point. You know, you've reached a stage where you can't go back. The sea levels, it's not as if the sea levels are going to recede. So I think there is this sort of growing move now. There's a lot of intersectoral collaborations that are happening in these past few years between you know, like agencies like the UN Environmental, UNEP and UNESCO, or there's also a recent I think sharing of it was I think iCommerce was involved, and then UNESCO as well was involved. I think it's the end of last year, 2021, and you know, and IPCC was involved as well. And so you need to have these forums in order to try and shape the language and to try, and from then on, I think then really try and bring the message home to state parties who may not yet see the impact of climate change or may not really understand it, but they need to see it now, because otherwise they're going to end up like the nations which are in critical danger now, and who have no choice. You know, that is the kind of example that you need to set, because otherwise no one is going to prioritize, you know, mitigating the impact of climate change. Yeah.
Okay, we've got two questions at the moment. The first is from James, and James asks, it seems that the UN conventions are focused on climate change threats to cultural heritage. Would it not be well for the UN from now on to equally emphasize how cultural heritage can be a basis for climate change mitigation? So what do you think? Do you think that the reverse is true, that cultural heritage, protection of cultural heritage can in a way also help to mitigate the climate emergency?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the, I would say that at least from the cultural heritage conventions and their guidelines and directives, there is that recognition that actually cultural heritage can, mitigate the impact of climate change and therefore mitigate the impact of cultural heritage. So it's sort of like, I wouldn't say it's a cycle, but it sort of feeds into itself to try and help mitigate the impact of climate change and then through intangible cultural heritage. And I think that at least for
do any examples come to mind? Do any examples sort of come to mind for you?
I can't think of any examples from the Southeast Asian perspective, but when you think about the Australian wildfires that happened, I think beginning of 2020, before the pandemic, huge wildfires, and I think there was a lot of talk about how the wildfires, the extent of the wildfires, and the severity of wildfires occurred because they didn't really take into account a lot of the indigenous knowledge by the Aboriginals on how they've managed. So the wildfires aren't unknown in Australia. They have occurred for a very long time, but the intensity and the frequency of the wildfires would have been mitigated if they had taken into account, the knowledge that the Aboriginal community had in tending to nature and really understanding how to deal with nature. And I think, and that, if you can mitigate climate change, I think that also feeds into mitigating intangible culture, mitigating like the deterioration of intangible cultural heritage, because you're actually sort of valorizing and you're sort of showing, it's really important, this intangible cultural heritage and knowledge, because without this, then the climate change is going to get worse, and these events are just going to get they're just going to get more intense and frequent.
Okay, the second question is from David. David asks, or David comments, Asia generally has very poor record in preserving even their non-colonial heritage. So why will climate change make a difference as a driving factor? The end goal is the same. What do you think?
I don't feel like I'm in the position to sort of pass judgment on whether Asia is doing whether it's doing a good job or not of protecting cultural heritage. But maybe it's just for me, I think one step is awareness. And one step is really sort of increasing the awareness, and maybe, having sort of a table like that, one of the tables that I talked about earlier, where you have all these different linkages and relationships between, changes in the climate and what it can do to sort of how it impacts different cultural heritage, from like the decay of stone, for example, or the decay of other types of material, and like decay. So it's really about drawing the linkages and showing actually, and I think part of the issue is also that it feels as if, I was going through a lot of reports and reading a lot of data, trying to understand, the Southeast Asian perspective at least, and there wasn't much. I think you have, I think in terms of the region, maybe Thailand is the leader, but there isn't much in terms of, say, like studies in terms of examining, how certain properties, World Heritage properties in the region are being impacted, for example, by climate change. There's no sort of analysis over a period of time. And so I think more needs to be done on that. More, more attention needs to be given to that.
Yeah, it seems to me also that
it can be channeled, can be found and channeled on these issues as well.
Yeah, it seems to me that one of the problems is that sometimes protection of cultural heritage is seen to be an optional extra. It's something that if we have the luxury of time and money, then we'll get to eventually. And if that is not indeed the case, then that message needs to be explained more clearly, perhaps. But you can see that countries have a lot of different priorities. There are political problems, there are economic problems, especially, and we've seen that in our region as well. And so these would tend to be issues that are focused on. and heritage and even climate, the climate emergency would then tend to get pushed down the list of priorities. So it's a difficult issue, right? I mean, how then do you encourage governments who are grappling with sort of more pressing issues, perhaps like people's daily expenses and the cost of living and so on, to look at this issue as well? And I think it is very challenging, but hopefully there's some way of weaving the message in and saying at least you've got to start thinking about it, because otherwise it might be too late to do anything concrete about it, right? Yeah. Okay, we've got a question from James. James is saying, in the area of built heritage conservation, there is a well-known saying that the greenest building is one that isn't built. This is in support of restoring and repurposing historic or heritage buildings rather than demolishing and rebuilding. So this is perhaps an example of how cultural heritage protection might help the green movement and therefore mitigate climate change. So the idea that we encourage renovation, restoring, repurposing of buildings rather than demolition and rebuilding. What do you think about this?
I mean, that's such a great idea. Thanks so much, James. Again, this is not my main primary research, and so it's so nice to hear different perspectives and really, we all have blind spots as well. And I think that's such a great point in showing that, yes, I think that we need to also focus on existing buildings and seeing, how can we preserve them, if these buildings, and how can we do so without having to construct another like skyscraper, because that seems to be sort of the tendency is to demolish older buildings and then to build, these new sort of buildings with new materials and stuff like that, which are not like the old buildings and maybe don't really take into account the climate of the place or sort of the different conditions of the place that it's being constructed. So yeah, I think that's a really useful indicator as well.
And it strikes me that this is where states, governments can do something, right? Because you can incentivize developers to look into refurbishing old buildings through policies, preferential taxes, that's the sort of thing, to kind of nudge them into doing this rather than making it very easy to knock down and rebuild. So this is where policies can be adopted by governments to do this. Yeah. Okay, we've got another comment from David. He points out that destruction of heritage is a far shorter duration issue than the impact of climate change. So do you think that this is something that the authorities should perhaps prioritize? And how can they do this?
I think it really depends on what cultural heritage is being referred to, because as I was saying, there are so many different types of cultural heritage, and I think there is a tendency sometimes for some people to view cultural heritage as something tangible and some to view as intangible, and then you just forget about all the different complexities. So I don't think there is one straight answer. There is one sort of just one general answer that I can give for this, because both are actually, I mean, climate change is also like a really, really scary thing that's happening. I mean, I experienced it this week as well. Like, honestly, the heat wave was really one of the worst experiences I've ever had in my life. And London has no air conditioning or AC, and so that was horrible. And so I think that we cannot underestimate, the importance of both. But it's not for me to say, we should prioritize one over the other, because it's going to affect different countries differently. Yeah.
I was very struck by a news article I saw, which I think was about London. Apparently, because of the hot weather, one of the bridges that spans the Thames had to be specially wrapped in some way because they were afraid that it would be damaged by the heat, and I think this was done perhaps more for safety rather than to protect the heritage. But one can certainly see how an old structure could be very vulnerable to extremes of temperature or maybe rainfall, that it was not built to withstand at the time of its construction. And so this might be a problem that becomes more frequent, right? And so countries need to start thinking about this, because it seems like adopting a patchwork kind of approach, then like, oh, we've got to do something because there's a heat wave coming, is probably not the best way to deal with this issue on a long-term basis, is it?
Yeah, I agree. You definitely cannot take a patchwork approach. I think there needs to be more thought put into policies relating to climate change and cultural heritage. It can't be reactive because otherwise going to be caught out by the sheer unpredictability of climate change. You can't predict. I mean, you can predict to a certain extent, but you can't predict when it's going to happen. You can't predict the actual intensity, but you know that it's going to come. So that's something that you need to take into account. Yeah.
Well, it's 4 p.m. So I think we will call it a day. Thank you, everyone, for your interesting questions and comments. Thank you, Zaki, as well, for shedding some light on the connections between cultural heritage and the climate emergency. I think this is certainly a topic that we will need to continually revisit from time to time as we grapple with these very difficult issues. I think the organizers want me to say something about another event that's coming up next week. So let me just pull out the information about that. Whoops, where have I put it? So next week, next Saturday, at the same time, which is 2 p.m. Bangkok time, GMT +7, there will be a talk called On Recreating Singapore Craft, Identity, Innovation, and Sustainability by Yao Shijia. And she will be talking about traditional crafts in Singapore in the age of mass production and in a very modern environment. So what future is there for these traditional crafts, and how can we sort of continue to find new and creative ways of ensuring that this forms of culture and traditional wisdom get carried on. So I hope you will consider joining us. There's information on our website and our Facebook group about this. So please do sign up and join us then as well. Let me hand you back to the organizers in case there are any final remarks or comments from them.
Thank you very much, Zaki and Dr. Jack, for your time today and for the very interesting talk. On behalf of Zisha, we'd like to thank you very much for joining us on this Saturday afternoon. We wish everybody a great weekend, and please stay tuned for our next Sha Time series. Sawadee khap, and thank you from Bangkok.
Okay, thank you everyone. Bye, have a good day.
Thank you, bye.